Princess Diana stepped through the shadows of Kensington Palace's inner courtyard. No cameras, no crowds, just her and a single royal guard. She pulled him aside and whispered something that made his blood run cold. 3 words that would haunt him for 27 years. Because 6 days later, Diana was dead in a Paris tunnel. And the guard who heard her final warning knew exactly why. Now, before we reveal what she told him that night, make sure you're subscribed to our channel Guard Watch and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Diana's death. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon that September evening in 1990, the kind of steady drizzle that made the cobblestones in Kensington Palace's inner courtyard slick and dark as black glass. Amber light from wrought iron lanterns caught the wet stone, and the air smelled of autumn and secrets. Staff Sergeant Michael Langford stood at his post just inside the Eastern Service Gate. At 42, he'd spent 20 years in the Grenadier Guards, Afghanistan, Bosnia, and ceremonial duty in London. This quiet courtyard was different from his usual posts. No crowds, no cameras, just shadows and the kind of place where important conversations happened after dark. That's when he saw her. Princess Diana stepped through a side entrance at the far end of the courtyard, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a soft click. She wasn't dressed for public appearances. Just a simple cream blouse beneath a dark trench coat, collar turned up against the drizzle. In one hand she carried a slim folder held close to her side. Her hair was slightly tousled, her makeup minimal, and she moved with quiet purpose, like someone who didn't want to be seen. For a heartbeat, Langford thought she might head toward the waiting cars in the far archway. But her gaze swept the courtyard and found him. There was no polite royal detachment in that look. Something urgent, as though she'd been searching for exactly the right person and had decided he would do. She glanced over her shoulder, then began walking toward him, heels tapping softly against the wet stone. Langford kept his posture rigid, but his training made him notice everything. The tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tightened around the folder, how she kept checking the courtyard's edges. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine mist of rain on her coat, she didn't smile. "Sergeant," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his directly. "Walk with me, please." It wasn't an order, but there was no mistaking it for a request she expected refused. His orders were to remain at post, but some moments carry their own authority. He fell in 2 paces behind as they crossed toward a covered colonnade that ran along the east wing. The drizzle deepened as they moved toward a covered colonnade, their footsteps echoing in the semi-darkness. The stone pillars blocked most of the wind, creating pockets of shadow where the lantern light couldn't reach. "You've been with the Grenadiers some time," she began quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Over 20 years. Operational service?" "Afghanistan. Twice. Bosnia before that." A faint smile touched her lips. Respect, not amusement. "So you've seen enough to know when something feels off." They turned left, following a narrower walkway that skirted a walled garden. The rain fell harder now, and her voice dropped. "There are arrangements being made, changes to my place, my role." Langford kept his gaze ahead, scanning the path automatically for obstacles or potential threats, but his attention was entirely focused on her words and the way she was choosing to deliver them. This wasn't the kind of conversation that happened accidentally, and it wasn't the kind of information that got shared with random staff members without a specific purpose. "I wouldn't know about," he began, but she interrupted him gently, not cutting him off so much as redirecting the conversation away from the safe territory of professional ignorance. "No," she said, and there was something almost grateful in her voice, as if his discretion was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "I don't expect you to, but you understand the sort of people who make arrangements, and how they speak when they're certain no one will challenge them." There was a pause, just long enough for the sound of the rain to fill the space between them, and for Langford to process what she was really saying. She wasn't talking about official protocols or ceremonial adjustments. She was talking about something more personal, more dangerous, the kind of arrangements that happened in private conversations and altered the course of people's lives without ever appearing in official documents. He could feel her looking at him now, not directly, but in that peripheral way that allowed her to gauge his reaction without being obvious about it. She was deciding something, weighing how much she could trust a man she barely knew, with information that could be dangerous for both of them. "You know," she continued softly, her voice barely audible above the rain, "how, in some situations, you can sense when the decision's already been made, even before the meeting is over, even before anyone says anything definitive." He gave a single slow nod. "Yes, ma'am." He did know. He'd sat in briefing rooms where officers discussed operations that would send people into danger, had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished genuine strategy meetings from exercises in confirming decisions that had already been reached behind closed doors. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the palace windows, faint squares of golden light that seemed impossibly distant from where they stood in the rain-soaked shadows. When she looked back at him, there was something in her expression that he'd seen before on the faces of soldiers who'd realized they were in more danger than their training had prepared them for. "That's where I am now," she said quietly. "The decisions are made. I'm an obstacle to be managed." They had reached a small stone archway at the far end of the garden wall, an architectural detail that created a natural alcove, shadowed and recessed from the main path. She stepped into it without hesitation, and the sound of the rain immediately softened to a distant hiss, the stone walls creating an intimacy that made the palace feel miles away instead of just yards. Here, in this pocket of darkness, the world felt narrowed to just the two of them. The light from the courtyard lanterns didn't reach this far, and the smell of wet ivy hung heavy in the air, earthy and old, in a way that spoke of secrets that had been kept in these shadows for decades, maybe centuries. She let out a slow breath, visible in the cool air, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter still, barely more than a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have. "I didn't bring you here for protocol, Sergeant," she said, and for the first time since she'd approached him, there was something that might have been vulnerability in her voice. "I needed someone who would listen and remember." Langford stood motionless, his training holding him steady, but inside he could feel the atmosphere shifting in a way that reminded him of moments in combat zones when the situation moved from routine to life and death without warning. This was no longer a casual conversation between a royal and a guard. Whatever she was about to say, it was personal, urgent, and it carried the kind of weight that changed people's lives. For a long moment, she didn't speak at all. The only sound was the rain beyond the alcove, and the faint drip of water from the ivy above, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark time while she gathered herself for whatever came next. Langford waited, eyes forward, but aware of her presence beside him, in a way that felt less like protocol and more like two people sharing something dangerous. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, chosen with the care of someone who understood that some truths could only be spoken once. "Some people here see me as a problem," she said quietly, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. "Not in public, of course. Out there, I'm the smiling face in photographs, the charitable cause they can point to when they need to demonstrate compassion. But behind closed doors, in the conversations that matter, I'm an obstacle." Langford's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. In his experience, reacting too quickly could close a conversation before it truly began, and something told him that whatever she was building toward required patience, the kind of careful attention that allowed people to reveal dangerous truths at their own pace. She glanced toward the palace again, her expression unreadable in the shadows, but her posture suggesting someone who was acutely aware of being watched, even here in this hidden alcove. "I wasn't naive when I married into this," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact but quiet. "I knew there were histories, preferences, a certain closeness between people that was never going to fade, no matter the vows made in public or the promises spoken in Westminster Abbey." She didn't name them. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the damp air between them, heavy with the weight of things that everyone knew but no one was supposed to acknowledge, the kind of open secret that shaped everything while officially existing nowhere. "They wanted something different from the start," she said, voice calm but carrying a current of anger that she was working to keep controlled. "A version of the monarchy that didn't include me in the picture. Not immediately, of course. That would have been too obvious, too messy, but eventually. And I think, no, I know, They've been working toward it for years. Langford shifted his weight slightly, the movement slow enough to maintain his formal posture, while acknowledging that he was listening, that he understood the significance of what she was telling him. He'd heard vague mutterings over the years, in the guarded way that palace staff sometimes spoke when they thought they were out of earshot, rumours and speculation that floated through the corridors like smoke. But hearing it from her, unvarnished and without the careful layers of official politeness, was different, more real, more dangerous. Her gaze returned to him, and in the dim light filtering through the ivy, he could see something in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of soldiers who'd realized they were in enemy territory without backup. "My shield has always been the public," she said, and there was something almost clinical in the way she analyzed her own situation. "The people. As long as they want me there, as long as they see me as theirs, instead of just another member of the family, I've been safe. Protected by their affection in a way that makes it impossible for anyone to move against me directly." She paused, and Langford thought of Afghanistan, of the way an enemy might approach a well-defended position, not by charging it directly, but by undermining its support, cutting it off from allies and supply lines until it stood alone and vulnerable. "But lately," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "I can feel that shield being chipped away, quietly, subtly. A few carefully placed stories in the papers here, a whisper there, just enough to make me seem unstable, difficult, the kind of person who might be more trouble than she's worth." Her analysis was precise, tactical, the kind of assessment that military officers made when evaluating threats that couldn't be met with direct action. But there was something else underneath it, a personal pain that spoke of someone watching her own reputation being systematically destroyed by people she'd trusted. "I've overheard things," she said, and now her voice carried a weight that made Langford's chest tighten. "Conversations I wasn't meant to hear. They never use plain words, of course, and they're too sophisticated for that. They talk in euphemisms about resolving the situation or moving forward in a new chapter or finding a path that works for everyone." She looked away for a moment, watching a rivulet of water snake down the stone arch. And when she spoke again, there was something in her tone that reminded him of intelligence briefings, where officers discussed enemy capabilities in language designed to obscure the human cost of what they were planning. "They smile while they say it," she said quietly. "That's the thing that chills me most. They discuss my future, my removal from their future, with the same pleasant efficiency they'd use to plan a garden party, and they think I don't notice." She turned back to him, and there was something in her expression that made him understand why she'd sought him out specifically, why she'd chosen a soldier with operational experience to hear what she had to say. "But I do notice, Sergeant, I always have, and what I've noticed is that people who see you as an obstacle eventually decide to remove you. The only question is how." The way she said it, not if, but how, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the damp air or the rain still falling beyond their sheltered alcove. This wasn't speculation or paranoia. This was someone who'd gathered intelligence on her own situation and reached a conclusion that terrified her. She moved a little deeper into the alcove, just far enough that the glow from the nearest lantern no longer reached her face, leaving her as little more than a silhouette against the darker stone. Langford adjusted half a step to keep her in his peripheral vision, every sense tuned to the moment in the way that years of dangerous duty had taught him to recognize when a situation was moving toward crisis. When she spoke again, there was no preamble, no careful build-up to ease him into what she was about to say. "It's Charles," she said softly, the words dropping into the silence like stones into still water. "And Camilla. It's always been them." The names landed without drama, but with the certainty of facts she had long since stopped debating with herself. She didn't look at him as she spoke. Her eyes seemed fixed on something far beyond the palace walls, as if she were looking into a future that only she could see. "They've been aligned from the start," she continued, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been exhaustion. "I've accepted that for years, tried to find a way to live with it, to make the best of a situation that was never going to be what I'd hoped for. But lately," she paused, drawing a slow breath as if steadying herself for what came next. Lately, I've realized it's not enough for them to be together quietly. They want the throne as a pair. And for that to happen cleanly, without scandal or messy divorces or public sympathy for the discarded wife, I have to vanish. Not just step aside, vanish. Langford kept his posture rigid, but inside, the words were settling into place with the terrible logic of a tactical assessment he didn't want to accept. Everything she was describing made sense in the cold, strategic way that military planners approached complex problems with multiple variables and limited options. She turned toward him now, her expression calm, in a way that was somehow more unsettling than anger or fear would have been. "Accidents happen to those who stand in the way too long," she said, and the line was delivered without bitterness or theatrics, as if she were quoting a law of nature that couldn't be argued with or appealed. The phrase hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and spoken with the kind of quiet certainty that made it impossible to dismiss as melodrama or paranoia. She was telling him something specific, something she believed with absolute conviction, and the weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like equipment he hadn't asked to carry but couldn't set down. "If anything happens to me," she continued, her eyes searching his face in the dim light, "you remember this conversation. You remember that I never chose to fade away, never agreed to disappear quietly into some convenient exile where I'd stop being a problem for people who want to rewrite history without me in it." Her gaze was direct, unflinching, fixing the instruction in place with the authority of someone giving orders that she expected to be followed long after she was no longer there to enforce them. Langford felt the weight of her attention in a way he hadn't experienced since standing before commanding officers in war zones. When the difference between understanding orders and following them could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. This wasn't a casual request, or the anxious rambling of someone overwhelmed by palace politics. This was a directive, delivered with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was asking and why it mattered. She glanced briefly toward the palace again, and when she looked back, there was something in her expression that reminded him of soldiers who'd volunteered for missions they knew they might not return from, people who'd made peace with outcomes they couldn't control. "When it happens," she said quietly, and the certainty in those 3 words made his blood run cold. "You'll understand everything. The timing, the circumstances, the convenient explanations that make it all seem inevitable instead of planned. And when that understanding comes, I need you to remember that it wasn't inevitable. It was chosen." The rain outside the alcove had steadied to a soft, constant rhythm, and somewhere beyond the walls, a car door closed, with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that followed her words. Langford realized he was holding his breath, waiting for something more, some final piece of information that would make sense of what she'd told him. Instead, she stepped past him, close enough that he caught the faint scent of her perfume beneath the damp air, something light and floral that seemed impossibly ordinary given the weight of their conversation. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice returning to something closer to the tone she'd used when first approaching him in the courtyard. "Not for tonight's duty, for listening, for being someone who'll remember when remembering becomes important." And then she was moving past him back toward the colonnade, her footsteps echoing softly as she retraced their path toward the private entrance where this conversation had begun. Langford remained in the alcove for a long moment, watching her silhouette disappear into the shadows, listening to the sound of her heels on wet stone growing fainter until it was lost beneath the steady whisper of rain. When he finally stepped out from the alcove into the open courtyard, the drizzle was cool against his face, a sharp reminder of the ordinary world that continued around him while his mind struggled to process what he'd just heard. Diana was already halfway across the courtyard, her pace unhurried but purposeful, the slim folder still tucked under her arm. She didn't look back, and something about the finality of that decision told him that she considered their conversation complete, that whatever she'd needed from him had been delivered and received. He followed at a respectful distance until she reached the side entrance where this had all begun. A member of her household staff appeared as if from nowhere, holding the door open just wide enough for her to slip inside. There was a brief exchange he couldn't hear, words too quiet to carry across the courtyard, and then the heavy oak door closed with a soft click that seemed to mark the end of something significant. Langford turned back toward his post, boots finding their way automatically across the familiar stones, while his mind remained fixed on her words and the way she'd delivered them. The courtyard looked exactly as it had an hour before, wet stone reflecting lantern light, the faint glow of windows in the palace walls, the muted sounds of a building that never truly slept. But it didn't feel the same. Nothing felt the same. He settled into his position by the eastern service gate, boots square on the slick cobblestones, rifle held in perfect ceremonial balance. On the surface, he was the image of regulation discipline, just another uniform in a palace full of them, part of the invisible machinery that kept the monarchy functioning with clockwork precision. But inside, her words played on a loop, each phrase carrying weight that seemed to grow heavier with repetition. Accidents happen to those who stand in the way too long. When it happens, you'll understand everything. The sentences kept circling back, not just in her voice, but accompanied by the memory of how she'd looked when she said them, the quiet certainty, the careful way she'd chosen her words, the sense that she was passing on intelligence that someone needed to preserve. This wasn't the product of stress or imagination. This was testimony from someone who'd seen enough to know what was coming, and who understood that her only option was to make sure the truth survived her. The rest of the shift passed in a kind of slow-motion routine that felt surreal after the intensity of their conversation. He acknowledged the passing of a senior aide with a precise nod, watched as a catering truck rolled through the archway with supplies for some event he'd never see, stood through the muted echo of footsteps and the occasional murmur of staff moving along the colonnade on business that seemed impossibly ordinary, given what he now knew. The rain eased gradually, leaving the air cool and metallic, carrying the scent of wet stone and the promise of clearer weather tomorrow. Somewhere above, a window closed with a sharp click that made him think of the sound the door had made when Diana disappeared back into the palace, carrying her secrets and her certainty about what was coming. When his relief arrived just before midnight, Langford gave the standard, clipped report, nothing unusual to note, and handed over his post with the same professional efficiency he'd maintained for over 20 years. Walking back through the inner corridors toward the guards' quarters, he kept his expression neutral, his bearing, regulation perfect, giving away nothing of the conversation that had changed everything. But once inside the quiet of the locker room, he sat on the bench longer than necessary before beginning to unbuckle his ceremonial kit. Her final look, her choice of words, the deliberate way she'd pulled him out of the normal routine to deliver information that felt more like a briefing than a conversation. It all pressed in on him, heavy with implications he wasn't sure he wanted to fully understand. He didn't yet know if what he'd heard was fear speaking or foreknowledge. All he knew was that a woman who lived her life under constant scrutiny had chosen to step into the shadows with him, trading her safety for the chance to ensure that her words would not vanish if she did. The following morning broke clear and crisp. As Langford moved through his usual routine, his eyes were sharper, scanning for details he might otherwise have missed. It didn't take long to notice them. 2 unfamiliar faces in the security rotation. Men who wore the uniform correctly, but whose manner suggested private protection work rather than ceremonial duty. A senior equerry, moving in brisk, clipped strides, avoiding casual conversation. Access points to certain wings suddenly restricted, explained away as routine maintenance, but implemented without notice. A few days later, Langford overheard a footman mention, "She's off to Paris at the weekend." The words hit like a physical blow. Paris. That afternoon he saw her stepping into a waiting car. For a moment their eyes met through the partially lowered window. She smiled faintly, not her public smile, but something smaller, more personal. There was finality in it, like a farewell. The car pulled away, and Langford returned his gaze to his post. But that smile stayed with him, carrying the weight of everything she'd told him in the shadows. 6 days later, the knock came at dawn. 3 firm raps on the guard's quarters door. A young guard stood in the corridor, face pale. "Sir, it's the princess. Paris, there's been an accident." The word didn't fit. Accident. Minor mishaps, parking lot fender benders. Not a woman stepping into a car with that final smile. By the time Langford reached the mess hall, television screens showed grainy footage from Paris. Blue police lights, figures in reflective vests, a newsreader's shaken voice. Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car crash in Paris. The sentence blurred under blood rushing in his ears. Reports trickled in throughout the morning. A late-night drive through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, a high-speed chase by paparazzi, a driver allegedly intoxicated, security arrangements changed at the last minute, her usual protection officer absent, for reasons that seemed reasonable in isolation but suspicious as part of a larger pattern. Langford didn't need every detail. The framework had been there in everything she'd told him. This wasn't paranoia. It was the fulfillment of a warning delivered with calm certainty by someone who'd analysed her situation and reached the only logical conclusion. The formal announcement came through official channels, with the kind of carefully worded language that conveyed appropriate grief while avoiding any questions about the circumstances that had led to her death. Tragic accident, pursuing photographers, high speed, intoxication. All the elements that would make investigation seem redundant and speculation seem disrespectful to her memory. But sitting in the mess hall, as colleagues moved around him in various stages of shock and disbelief, Langford heard her voice as clearly as if she were standing next to him. Accidents happen to those who stand in the way too long. When it happens, you'll understand everything. And he did understand. Not every detail, not every connection, but the essential truth that she'd trusted him to preserve. This wasn't the random tragedy that the official narrative would present. This was the solution to a problem that had been planned, discussed in euphemistic language, and executed with the kind of efficiency that made it look like fate rather than design. 3 days later, Langford stood at attention along the funeral route, one face among hundreds of uniformed men and women who lined the streets of London as the procession made its way from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey. The crowds were unlike anything he'd seen in his years of ceremonial duty, not just large, but emotionally charged in a way that spoke of genuine grief rather than curiosity or tradition. The coffin passed on its gun carriage, covered with flowers and the royal standard, followed by the official mourners whose faces showed appropriate solemnity for the cameras that tracked their every movement. Charles walked with careful dignity, his expression composed in the way that public figures learn to manage personal tragedy. Camilla, present but positioned carefully to avoid drawing attention, her presence noted by those who understood the significance, but not emphasized by those who controlled the narrative. As the procession disappeared toward Westminster Abbey, Langford remained at his post until the last official car had passed, then stood through the long silence that followed as London struggled to process what it had witnessed and what it meant for the future of the institution that had just lost its most beloved member. But for him, standing on that London street as the crowd slowly dispersed, the funeral wasn't an ending. It was a confirmation of everything Diana had understood about her situation and trusted him to remember. The timing, the circumstances, the convenient explanations that made her death seem inevitable rather than chosen. All of it had unfolded exactly as she'd predicted, with the precision of people who'd planned carefully and executed efficiently. The woman who'd pulled him into the shadows of Kensington Palace had understood that her time was running out, and she'd used what little she had left to make sure that someone would remember the truth, even after she was no longer there to tell it. In that brief conversation under the ivy-covered arch, she'd passed on more than just her fears or suspicions. She'd given him a mission that would last the rest of his life, to be the witness who remembered when everyone else chose to forget. Standing in the autumn sunshine as London gradually returned to normal, Langford felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders, like equipment he'd never asked to carry but couldn't set down. Diana was gone, but her truth remained, preserved in the memory of a conversation that had lasted less than 30 minutes but would echo for the rest of his life. The official investigation would conclude what investigations always concluded when the stakes were high enough and the right people had enough to lose. Accident, tragedy. No evidence of conspiracy or foul play. Case closed. Truth buried. Convenient narrative established for history books that would record her death as the random consequence of celebrity culture and aggressive journalism. But in a quiet corner of his mind, Langford would always carry the echo of her voice in that shadowed alcove, the certainty with which she'd spoken about timing and convenience, and the kind of accidents that happened to people who stood in the way too long. She'd known what was coming, had tried to prepare him for the moment when understanding would arrive like a physical blow, and had trusted him to remember what others would be pressured to forget. 27 years later, that trust remained unbroken, a promise kept to a woman who'd used her final days to ensure that someone would preserve the truth she'd died trying to tell. Do you think Princess Diana knew exactly what was coming that night in Paris? And if you had been that guard, would her words have stayed with you for the rest of your life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If you found this story gripping, make sure you tap the like button, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's video. Share this with someone who still wonders about Diana's final days. I think they'll want to hear it. Watch the videos now appearing on your screen for more stories like this, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time with a brand new one.